Hi, everyone, and welcome to OR Today webinars. We have a great presentation for you today by Jamie Zarembinski and Michelle Lemmons. Jamie and Michelle will review the 2021 AAMI and AORN updated guidelines surrounding best practices for the care, evaluation, and protection of electrosurgical instruments. OR Today would like to thank our sponsor, Key Surgical. Key Surgical is a leading global provider of sterile processing, operating room, and endoscopy products, supporting a wide range of processes and procedures in hospitals, same-day surgery facilities, GI centers, and more. For over 30 years, they have stayed true to their mission of providing high-quality products paired with superior customer experience and service. But now they also provide industry-accredited education courses and in-services. For more information, please visit keysurgical.com. For nearly 20 years, OR Today has provided perioperative and SPD professionals with up-to-date news and information about their profession, including new guidelines, techniques, and equipment, as well as practical information for career building, problem solving, and overall well-being. Please visit ortoday.com to sign up for your free subscription. Today's webinar is eligible for continuing education credit by the State of California Board of Registered Nursing. You can obtain your certificate by completing today's post-webinar survey. More details on this at the end of today's webinar. We'll wrap up today's presentation with a live Q&A. You can submit your questions at any time during the webinar by using the questions feature on the GoToWebinar dashboard. We'll get through as many questions as time allows. As I mentioned earlier, our speakers today are Jamie Zarembinski and Michelle Lemmons. Jamie, you may begin whenever you are ready.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for joining Michelle and I today. I'm very excited to be talking about this topic, which is perioperative and sterile processing electrosurgical instrument best practices. Stay ready so you don't have to get ready. In 2021, the Association for the Advancement of Medical Instrumentation, also known as AAMI, and Association of Perioperative Registered Nurses, AORN, each updated their guidelines surrounding best practices for care, evaluation, and protection of electrosurgical instruments. So in this webinar, again, we'll detail some of the exact changes that were made, why they are significant, and how they impact the daily actions of sterile processing and perioperative professionals. Further, we'll discuss the consequences of a reactive approach to instrument care versus a proactive approach. Stay ready so you don't have to get ready.
And just a little disclaimer that we start all of our presentations with, we do our absolute best to provide you with up-to-date information on best practices. The information that we provide may not include every single detail relative to your facility or your facility's policies and procedures, as well as it might not include your state and federal law. Once again, our objectives for today are that we are going to cover all of these best practices, right? I will skip reading all of the objectives for you today. We are happy to share this presentation with you at the end, and we really hope you ask for it. We would love to hear from you after today.
So Michelle and I both at the early January 2021 got updates from AAMI and AORN that stated that guidelines were being updated. So they send these nice little emails out to everyone.
I got an email from AORN just informing me that their electrosurgery guidelines had been updated. Now, AORN updates their guidelines every year. As part of their 2021 guidelines, they updated the electrosurgery guideline within their guidelines. Now, if you're wondering about how, when, or why these guidelines are updated, check out our webinar. We kind of cover a lot of those details about why and how they're updated in the New Year, New Guidelines, AORN guideline updates, electrosurgery, and you. So if you want more information.
Now, the AAMI amendments are 4 new amendments that were added to the AAMI ST79 that was last updated in 2017. And the 4 different amendments are A1, environmental services, fans, food, and drink. A2, inspection of insulated instruments, which is the world we'll live in this whole webinar. A3, modification of content pertaining to frequency of cleaning for routine care of sterilizers or sterile processing areas in the healthcare facilities. and A4, which is content addressing, recording BI lot numbers and sterilizer records for the sterile processing in healthcare facilities. Talking together like we do every single day, we both saw that one of the biggest in detail updates in both the organizations is insulated instrumentation. AORN and AAMI both having these updates, and we wanted to talk about it and kind of address it. So we talked about the impact that a few little emails can make and how they affect our daily practices. What are we really talking about here? Well, we did a little number crunching and want to kind of show you some numbers of the healthcare industry. So hospitals in the United States, there were 13,944 hospitals in 2019 that were running in the United States. Now, to make a little bit comparison of numbers, the US population in 2019 was about 328 million people. That gives us a ratio of 23,540 people per hospital. A lot of people that are going into hospitals. Next up is operating rooms in the United States. As of 2017, which is the most updated statistic we could find, there's about 224,720 operating rooms that are in the United States. In those operating rooms, there are about 51.4 million surgical procedures that happen in a year. 51.4, it's a lot of surgical procedures. Now, we can't count out the instruments that are used in these surgical procedures. So there are about 10.5 billion surgical instruments that get reprocessed in a year. That's a B with a billion. As of 2019, this is a statistic done by the US Bureau of Labor and Statistics. There are about 50,550 instrument specialist techs in the United States. And there are about 3.8 million nurses nationwide registered. This includes hospitals, ambulatory centers, clinics, and it's just kind of a broad statistic to understand. That's a lot of people that it can be influenced, and that an industry change like this that needs to happen, trying to reach every single person can be tough. Which is why we do what we do every day, by informing, collecting information, and creating webinars to help you navigate this fast-paced industry.
So drawing out that 51.4 million surgical procedures, another way we kind of were number crunching or thinking of the best way to really evaluate the impact of something like this. And what we know is that electrosurgery is used in about 80% of all surgical procedures in the US. My personal statement is I think it's probably more than that. We use it all the time. Almost every single procedure we're using electrosurgery. So this actually, that 80% is equivalent to about 40 million cases per year, to just over 40 million. So it is by far the most used energy generating device in the operating room. And now, kind of dramatically, but seriously, when we get this email, where do we even start? Often when we are on the floor, right, in the operating room and in sterile processing, we are literally doing about 3 things at once, while also answering the phone, and somebody is talking to us. There's an alarm ringing for something somewhere, right? We hear those even at our house when we go home after work. And then we're kind of thinking of what to get done first. So how do we even implement something like this? So even when we know they're coming, that these guidelines get updated every year, it can be really hard to keep up with. So the first normal question, right, is how do we make this information approachable and able to be implemented into our daily practice? Now, Jamie, I do not have time to sit down and read the entire book of guidelines every day. So how can we kind of hash this out? How can we make this applicable?
Thankfully, we don't have to read the whole book, and we don't have to always retain everything. We have access, and we're human, right? We've got a lot going on. Additionally, now that we have access in so many different ways, it's easy to find the information that is important for techs and OR nurses to be well informed on these industry updates, guidelines, and best practices. So let's go back to our email updates. AORN and actually AAMI have access to all 3. So online, in-department access, and on your phone. And it should be easy to access in the facility, and it should be available for you in your facility as well, and should be known where to find this information. So if you are in SPD, I know AORN guidelines is pretty well known for OR nursing, but if you are in SPD, you should have access to the AAMI ST79, and if you're reprocessing scopes also in your department, you should have access to AAMI ST91, along with instrument IFUs, literature from manufacturers, to maybe post on walls for reprocessing steps and help and guidance.
So now that we've talked a little bit about where we have access, how can we make even using these tools more efficient and helpful? You know, everybody would have more time, right? Nobody can make more time. It would be great. But a couple of the things that, you know, Jamie and I, when we're digging in these guidelines literally every day, that have made our lives just a little bit easier to kind of get to what we want. We're going to share just a few of those. So whether I access the guidelines on the app or on their website, I'll be taken to this page. It looks just like this. And a few kind of quick tips for using these guidelines, right, is first to just press the expand all sections button if you want to search a specific detail of the guidelines. Now, the other like kind of hot tip, this was such a game changer for us, but hitting Control F. And this will open that search bar or find. That's why it's an F, the find function. And for example, in this, I typed in insulation failure. That was exactly what I was searching for in the guideline. Now, next, the number of times this word is used will populate. So in this example, it's 20. And you can press that up and down arrow to get those highlighted in context. And finally, here was the example I was looking for, 2021 updated electrosurgery guideline. It was 3.5 that says inspect active electrodes for insulation failure before, during, and after a procedure. 3.5.1 says use an active electrode insulation integrity tester, say that 5 times fast, right? While preparing active electrodes for packaging during processing. And 3.5.2 says if an insulation failure is identified during processing, sterile processing personnel should remove the damaged device from service. So it made it a lot more efficient use of my time to get to exactly what I needed by a few tools.
And you can do this pretty much in any document. Often we see PDFs in the department. You can do it on a website too, which is really nice. That Control F function, Michelle, the day I figured it out, and I told you about it too, it's like, it just changes everything. So here is the AAMI ST79, and the one we're focusing on is Amendment 2. So what I'm going to do is search within the document for the keyword cleaning. So here is what I found. 8.2, inspection of instruments. Healthcare facilities should have a method of ensuring the cleanliness and integrity of every instrument and medical device used in every procedure. Upon inspection, medical devices with retained soil or residue should be subjected to repeated cleaning and decontamination processes until device is completely clean. Next up is a hot little tip for if you're navigating in any of the AAMI standards, so ST79, any of these amendments, and even the ST91, they have this section called the rationale. So this is where I find the why behind what we do. I often read this first and really figure out the content of the standard. Then I reread the standard. This will help me kind of figure out how this affects me and my daily practice. Because sometimes when you read those direct standards, it doesn't quite make sense. But the rationale there to help you kind of make sense of what you're reading.
Now, as we kind of like hop back to our main topic, right, electrosurgery, regarding these electrosurgery updates that were made, we're going to start at our very favorite place to always start, and that's right at the beginning with kind of a basic definition so we can all level set to the same starting point, right? So we'll briefly touch on what electrosurgery is, because just as kind of you were talking about that rationale, knowing what it is can really improve, you know, how it works. Understanding all of that can really improve our understanding of why this is important to talk about insulation failure and why each of our roles in all of our departments are so vital. So electrosurgery is defined as the use of radio frequency alternating current electricity to create heat in cells to cut or coagulate tissue. And it seems kind of like a long mouthful, but really what I think it's very vital to remember here is that electrical current is intentionally and precisely applied to a patient's body to create a desired tissue effect. And the insulation is actually what allows for that precise intentional application of the current in the desired location. So these images on the screen are just kind of our icons for laparoscopic and robotic electrosurgical instruments.
So the purpose of this presentation, we're going to cover, we're going to look at kind of the 3 different generations of laparoscopic instrumentation. This is important on what you have at your facility. So depending on the generation of instruments that you have at your facility may depend on installation inspection and testing and OR assembly. So just kind of putting this out there at the very beginning here, they can all look very different. And the first assembly here is actually a 3rd generation, which actually has 3 parts. The second animation is has 1-step assembly, so there's actually 2 parts. In the 3rd image, as you can see, nothing happened because nothing comes apart. So it's important to work with SPD and instrument manufacturers to know how to properly assemble the instruments before patient use. So here are some good examples from the facility I work at. Instruments are disassembled for decontamination, ready to be cleaned, then inspected on the pack and prep clean side with an installation tester. Inspecting installation is not just using an installation tester. In sterile processing, the techs need to be trained to inspect during the decontamination process, as well as working again with the instrument manufacturer to identify what to look for.
Now, kind of one of my favorite questions, right, is why do we care? Why do we really care actually about installation failure? Yep, precisely applying electrical current, but tell me more, right? Tell me what could happen. So installation failure, that includes any tears or damage to that insulation, actually provides an alternate pathway for electrical current to exit from the instrument or active electrode and can cause injury to a patient. In a few slides, we'll see a video example of that, but we'll kind of talk through it first. Now, this injury can go unnoticed by the team at the time of the injury. So during the procedure, they may or may not know that this has happened. And in fact, insulation failure is considered to be the primary cause of laparoscopic electrosurgical injuries. So it's very noteworthy when we talk about it. It's happening. In August 2009, Surgical Endoscopy magazine published a research study, and this study had been completed within 4 major urban hospitals. And the purpose of the study was to evaluate the incidence, how many times this is happening, how many times do we have insulation failures. And what they wanted to do was compare how frequently it was happening between disposable and reusable instruments and determine really the location where this insulation failure was occurring. So they tested 226 instruments, a mix really of reusable and disposable. And what they found, as I guess we might expect, is that reusable instruments had a greater incidence or frequency. They had more times, right, where they found insulation damage than disposable instruments. That was actually about 19% in reusable instruments compared to 3% in disposable. The second thing that they found is that insulation damage was most common in the distal or farthest away, the distal 3rd tip. So that's kind of the end that we have magnified here. And the reason we like to cover this as well is when we know this information, we really know those places to kind of focus on or monitor and watch. When reusable sets were evaluated, so reusable laparoscopic instruments, 71% of the sets had at least one instrument with insulation failure. So that's well over half. And then as a broad statistic, they actually found that 1 in every 5 reusable laparoscopic instruments has an insulation failure. Now, to further complicate all of this, right, other research shows us, not from this study, but from others, that 67% of stray electrosurgical burns go unnoticed during the procedure, so during surgery. Various statistics clearly identify the seriousness of these complications that are associated with this, including, they can be as small, right, using that very loosely, as an extended stay in the ICU after surgery, to as big as causing death in actually about 25% of the patients that suffer these complications when they aren't noted at the time of the procedure. And you might be wondering, like, Michelle, how on earth do you not notice this happening in surgery? How did you not see that? But when we break laparoscopic surgery down a little further, if you've never kind of seen it, right, in person, unlike open surgical procedures where the surgeon will make an incision large enough to, open up to directly view the organ, laparoscopic surgery is a form of minimally invasive surgery that involves the use of video cameras, telescopes and long, thin instruments called laparoscopic instruments to access a structure without fully opening the cavity that it is within. And they're through little tiny incisions that are usually no greater than, they can be no greater than an inch long. It can be a little bigger, but. Now the image that's captured by the camera is projected right onto a screen in the operating room. And that is where the surgical team is able to see their procedure area. That on the screen is the image that the team can see. So in their yellow field, right, that yellow box, they can see that small area, and that's depicted on the screen in the operating room. Now here in red is where those injuries occur, right? This could be a bowel injury, any other injury, right? That happens due to insulation damage. That electrical current is unintentionally applied outside of where they intended to apply it. So you can see the yellow box and you can see the screen, and then you see that red circle, and that's where the team actually can't see that that has occurred. And there may not be any immediate indication that really anything has gone wrong for the team in the operating room. So to kind of further complicate this, right, in addition to this small area of view, there's often multiple people in the room, and especially with laparoscopic procedures, there's might be a different person holding the camera and a different person holding the instrument, and all of them are working around the patient. And it's not to be, this is not intended to be a webinar that discourages laparoscopic surgery in any way. Instead, it's intended to be an informative discussion to gain understanding, to just promote patient safety. The more we know, the better we can do. There's many safety measures that are built into these procedures and into the instruments themselves that can reduce insulation failure complications. But as we've seen with some of the statistics, it does still happen. So let's look at that video example that was kind of made to depict the damage that insulation failure can cause. So we'll kind of let this play through for a second. You can see the tip of the instrument and where it's working. So this is really that, yellow box on the patient that we just saw, kind of what we can see. So now you see those red circles, and then you see our yellow box, I think. Yep, there it is, perfect. So the yellow box is what we're looking at and what we can see, and then these red circles kind of happen outside of that field of view, and that's where we get some of that damage. Another way to consider instruments is to kind of revisit the instrument itself. And note that a large portion of the instrument that's insulated is not visible when the current is actually being applied through that instrument. So for the purpose of this discussion, we kind of just split up the instrument into 3 zones. Zone 3, you can see there the handle and the top of the trocar. Zone 2, and then Zone 1. And Zone 1 is really that intended path right where we want the current to be applied. And for a majority of the case, that Zone 2, it's all insulated, is out of the surgical team's field of view. Now, often insulation damage is not visible to the naked eye without magnification or insulation testing. And those serious complications also might not be visible, as we saw in the last video.
So we see what electrosurgery looks like for the operating room. There's a lot of detail. There's actually a patient there in front of you. So from the sterile processing perspective, what does electrosurgery look like for us? While I know not all these instruments are necessarily electrosurgical instruments like the laparoscopic instruments or the insulated forceps, they have electrical components to them that may affect the patient in the procedure. So in sterile processing, we must diligently inspect all aspects of not only laparoscopic and insulated forceps, but robotic arms, cords, which are often hand washed. Light cords are also hand washed. If these are cracked or broken, they can be an ignition source. And then lastly is arthroscopic shaver handpieces, which I'm sure you guys in the operating room world and nurses have seen every single one of these instruments. So this is what it looks like from a sterile processing perspective, a little bit different. In the decontamination area and in the pack and prep, we take care and attention when handling these items. So using laparoscopic instruments and robotic arms as our primary example, never grab by the shaft or the distal tip. This can cause damage to the instrument. Care and attention is critical in handling of any of these items. For distal tip inspection, use lighted magnification to see distal tip, like Michelle previously mentioned. Insulation damage is most common in the 1/3 tip, so having lighted magnification on the pack and prep side is necessary for thorough inspection. Next up we have are the bipolar forceps, inspection of the tip for any frays and check the connection end to make sure that all the parts are there and nothing is cracked, missing, or broken. Again, the cord is not an insulated electrosurgical instrument, but cords can be associated with fire. They do have this insulation on them that needs to be inspected along with the distal tip and the connector. They are important tools in electrosurgery procedures. So Michelle just mentioned the 3 zones of the instrument. Zone 1, which are the yellow circles you can see here on our slide, and zone 3, which are the orange circles. They are visible during her procedure. As you can see, some of the instrumentation is fully visible during a procedure, but like Michelle mentioned, things still get missed. And as we know, there's a lot going on in a procedure. So it's important that sterile processing inspect each areas we just discussed.
So let's look at a couple opportunities, just like this. I love having these conversations where we can kind of talk about what are you doing and what am I doing and how they come together. I think that's how, I know Jamie agrees because we've talked about it so much, but just how we really can make a big difference in our daily professional lives, right? So let's look at a couple. These are our examples, areas where the sterile processing and the operating room can work together to prevent instrument damage and really improve patient care. So the first one that we'll talk about today is just in the operating room. If we do not eliminate eschar buildup on electrosurgical instrument tips, right?
Well, eschar buildup can significantly slow down the manual cleaning process. As you can see here, these are bipolar forceps that I received in the decontamination area that was not cleaned off during the procedure. And getting this off often happens with the metal brush, which we know can be an issue for this instrument, and it can be extremely hard to do. It often equals to longer soaking times and constant inspection of if it is actually cleaned, in air quotes. I'm going to put that if it's actually cleaned. In a few slides, we'll discuss how significant this time strain can really be in sterile processing. You need a lot of elbow grease for these when they come down nice build up.
Well, that makes absolute sense. Eschar is charred tissue residue. One surgeon I was listening to talk about eschar actually described it as caramelization or caramelization, however you say it, right? Literally dried caramel, if you think about that. It's so challenging to remove from anything. So eschar creates a challenge not only for perioperative professionals, we're trying to clean it off and get that instrument back, but also for sterile processing. So this can be a big barrier. In the operating room, this eschar can be dangerous for many reasons. You kind of can't see your surgical site as well, right? It's an insulator, which can impede actually the electrical current going through that instrument. Because it's so hard and challenging to remove, it takes away time. It causes frustration, of course. And relevant to our discussion today, sometimes other things that should not be used to remove eschar, such as the back of a knife handle and things, are used. And when we use these tools, it's so close to where the insulation is that insulation can actually be damaged where you're scraping and peeling it off. So the other kind of question that we get a lot is about coated active electrode tips. And these are not exempt from eschar either. That coating actually on a coated tip must be compromised for electrical current to pass through it. So you can see in the bottom picture where there's little holes in the coating. They actually kind of have to do that in order to pass that electrical current through. So we still get eschar buildup on literally every type of instrument. So let's talk about some best practices for caring for these instruments during the procedure. So first of all, right, is keeping the tip clean at all times during the surgical procedure and just wiping it between uses. Just like you wipe the counter, right, as you're cooking. You don't wait till the end, especially with caramel. Holy moly, that would be so challenging. Cleaning the tip away from the incision, not just wiping it right into the field. Not cleaning the active electrode tip with metal. That can cause insulation damage and other things, right? Damage to that instrument. Monitoring the power settings. This one isn't as clear, but a lot of times buildup on these instrument tips can actually lead to an increased need for power, and that can increase the likelihood of other complications. And then 2021, as we're talking about these guideline updates, AORN updated their guidelines to include the application of a non-stick solution to the electrosurgical instrument to provide a non-stick surface to reduce eschar buildup. So reducing that sticking and then reducing actually the buildup of that tissue. So this next slide is that exact guideline from AORN. So it says an anti-stick phospholipid solution may be used to decrease eschar buildup. High quality evidence supports the use of an anti-stick phospholipid solution to reduce surgical time. And then it goes into the detail of the study that was used to make this recommendation. And like Jamie said earlier, just reading that reference or why they made this recommendation can really help us to understand why it's important. So I'll read a little bit of that. I'm sorry, I know people are like, don't read the screen, but we'll read it. But in a randomized controlled trial, the two researchers that did this measured the difference in the number of handbacks, or the number of times that instrument was handed back for cleaning, and the length of the procedure in a pediatric adenoidectomy in which the anti-stick phospholipid was used. They actually found a 1 minute, 45-second decrease in the entire length of the procedure. So that was huge, right? Anytime we can save operating room time. And then a decrease of 3 handbacks. So less frustration, handing back, and overall less procedure time led them to make this recommendation, which is great for us.
So I wanted to show an example of a good tip. We do get good tips down in the department as well, but this is what it should look like when it comes to sterile processing. Leaving eschar buildup on the tip for SPD to clean can be challenging, and like we'll show here in a couple of slides, the time adds up quickly, especially if we're getting these as frequently as they're used in procedures and surgeries. You know that can really add up on time and slowing us down.
So another problem that is very common, right? We talk about all of this a lot in all of our departments is unmanaged cords or disorganized cords and instruments. So these pictures that are flashing across the screen were actually taken in one 8-hour shift at one single facility for one single sterile processing professional. Jamie Zarembinski. This was one shift in sterile processing.
And sound the alarms this morning. Tangled cords slow us down in sterile processing. Additionally, extra time to examine the cords for cracks, kinks, bends, especially if they're kind of all bound up like that. It can significantly affect the functionality of the cord if they're all bound together. And they're like octopus arms. They stick together and they really are hard to untangle. And so it actually does add a lot of time to our reprocessing cycle. So you might be thinking, is that really that big of a deal? Well, you're not the first person to ask this question to me. So it's important that in sterile processing, especially in decontam, we have a constant flow of instruments coming from the OR to SPD. So little things like this can add up and become significant. Decontam, pack and prep, assembly, sterilization, it can be added up to 2.5 to 3 hours or more if we are slowed down at these different spots. So implications of things coming down to decontam department, tangled, eschar buildup, like we've already mentioned, not pre-treated, can be a couple major things. One thing is time. So how long does it take to reprocess one dirty instrument? So this is not necessarily the time it takes. This is added time that it could potentially take. So if the case card is unorganized, you can add an additional 10 minutes to our reprocessing cycle of just trying to organize it and understand what's happening. Next is cleaning. Depending on pretreatment, it can add anywhere from 20 to 30 minutes to our actual manual cleaning process. Next up we have is the washer disinfector. When to run the mechanical washers, factors are to consider the different turnaround times of different items that we're getting in our department. It's important that we maximize washer disinfector space, so often we wait to fill the rack before starting the cycle. But if many things are on constant turnaround, it can take longer to reprocess the instrument sets. And ultimately, when we get to the workstation and sterilization, there's extra care and attention to check if things are broken or if we just need to get things organized so that it's ready for the next phase. So what does this look like? I just kind of showed you a brief overview and walkthrough of an instrument reprocessing flow. But what does it look like in time? I broke down each step in the instrument set cycle in time. So once those item gets down to decontam, manual cleaning takes about 20 minutes. And this is, I'm talking like veteran, well knowing the instrument sets that are coming down and understanding how flow works. Next up, we have the mechanical cycle that can take anywhere from 39 minutes to whatever set you have in your mechanical washers. Eye instruments can take up to 70 minutes in a mechanical cycle. So it all depends on what instruments you're reprocessing. Next up, we have assembly is 20 minutes. Again, this is a veteran. I've sat and looked at instrument sets for over 20 minutes trying to figure out what instruments are in there. So this is something that you're well versed in and you understand. Next up is we have wrapping as sets, which can take 2 minutes, but I'm sure there's people out there that'll challenge me on that, saying they can do it a lot faster. I want to see it. I am not very good at wrapping, getting better. So sometimes 2 minutes, it's more like 3 or 4 for me. Fill sterilizer cart, that can take upwards of 60 minutes. These racks are large. To be efficient, it's best to optimize our reprocessing cycle with a full load, and this can take time to get assembled, wrapped, and put on the rack depending on the number of techs back in decontamination and assembly and your workload that you have in your department. Next up we have is standard pre-vac cycles, and these can take anywhere from 70 minutes, and if you have different cycles or if you have gravity, it can take even longer. Next up we have is quarantine load for BI results. That can take around 20 minutes depending on the BI you have at your facility and what the manufacturer declares as the proper readout time for the biological indicator. On top of BI results, there's a lot of metal and a lot of instrument sets that can be on one sterilizer rack at once. So it may take time after the BI results are read before they can cool down and be handled appropriately. So Michelle, that totals to about 256 minutes. I challenged my math, please. I'm not good at math, so if I did that wrong, let me know. And that's about, I'm just gonna round up and say 4.5 hours. That's just for one instrument set. So disruptions can often lead to inefficiencies and changes in priorities, thus minimizing effectiveness. 84% of instruments that appear visually clean contain residual debris when further analyzed. I'm gonna say that again. 84% of instruments that appear visually clean contain residual debris when further analyzed. So it's important that techs are taking care and attention in every step of the reprocessing steps, not like nothing gets skipped or missed, which we know happens. Any instrument help from the OR can maintain a process flow to maximize efficient workflow in sterile processing.
Now, kind of one of the dialogues that happens a lot is kind of an us versus them dialogue, right? Where it's like, well, they do this, so then and it becomes like really like a fight, right? So I just want to, contrary to some of those dialogues or rumors, right? These unorganized cords or eschar left on the instruments are really not, most of the time, right? You are always going to have one person, but they're not kind of a passive aggressive snub or done intentionally to make that time increase, right? To make your job harder in sterile processing. Once again, it's just a great opportunity to communicate both of the challenges that we face, right, in the operating room and sterile processing. So anyone who works in the operating room would agree that the end of a surgical procedure is often one of the busiest times in the operating room. So kind of let's just dive in a little bit to what's happening during that post-procedure time before the instruments are brought back to decontam. First is that the circulator and the scrub are completing their final instrument, sharps, and other supply count. So this has to be done before that incision is closed and before the skin incision is closed so that all that final charting can get entered. So the number and type and the accuracy, right, of any specimens that were taken from the patient needs to be confirmed. So we're verbally confirming those back and forth together. The team must debrief and discuss the specimens, the procedures, the amount of blood loss, estimated blood loss and all of that. So we're all talking through that. If that same team is doing another procedure in the same room after that procedure, there may be a little bit of time there where they're discussing something specific or a need, how to prep for that next case that's coming in. And the final patient assessment is being completed, and either the patient's coming out of anesthesia or kind of completing those final assessments. And after all of this is done, the patient is then accompanied to the post-procedure, and the rush to turn over the room to prepare for the next case begins. People rush in, and while it is usually just the surgical tech, sometimes the circulator that's breaking down those instruments and organizing them, they might have help to get it done quicker. And sometimes, as we all have experienced, a little bit more help is not always better, right? Further, and to complicate all of this, all these people in the room, the patient even may be gone, there might be an emergency, and then everything gets washed, right? Everything completely gets changed, and we lose kind of track of things. So something that seems so clear, point A to point B, organize it, get it done. When things move very quickly, it's really easy to miss something that might seem very, very obvious to someone else.
So receiving a case cart in decontam can be as scary as opening a Jack in the Box. After you just mentioned, there's a lot of things going on. So you know in sterile processing, and you know in that Jack in the Box, that when you open that case cart, you're not sure what you're going to get. And you know when you start a Jack in the Box, that dang puppet is going to pop up and scare you. So you just don't know when you actually look in that case cart what you're going to get. So as a tech back in decontam, you must inspect and assess what you actually are getting in your case cart. Here's a great example of a well-organized case cart that I got at the facility that I work. You, right? So I'm like, okay, this is pretty well organized. I know what's going on. So I scan everything into department and then prioritize. Do I have to hand wash certain things? Is there something in there that's noted as a turnaround or written down that I know of that is a turnaround that I have to do first? Last is to start cleaning. Your sink as a sterile processing tech should be ready and prepped so you are ready to clean those instruments when they come down. Just stresses the fact that it's important to stay up to date on trainings, what to look for and how to organize, and to be as efficient as possible back at the sink and in decontam. And I think a huge critical component to this too is working together with your operating room and the sterile processing department so that we are understanding where we're each at each of the steps of the reprocessing cycle. So it's not all on the OR. Contrary to our previous two examples, sterile processing plays a critical role in electrosurgical instrumentation and procedure. This is in the form of installation integrity testing. Luckily for me, Michelle, I get to say it 10 times here. So I'll try to be very precise.
Challenge accepted, right?
If we skip this step or rush through it.
So just like that video kind of discussion we had at the beginning of this presentation, if these things are not done, the patient can have complications. So remembering that 1 in 5 of the reusable instruments have damage that they've found in this research study, and actually 67% of that injury is not noticed during the time of injury or at that time of injury. So we did talk about this kind of at length at the beginning, but we'll restate just a couple of things. Insulation failure provides an alternate pathway for that electrical current to leave the instrument and can cause unintentional patient injury. So some best practices to avoid insulation failure or to notice it, right, is to test 100% of insulated instruments, every single one, in sterile processing before assembling them for sterilization. Another way, we talked about this, is not to use metal to clean these instruments. Using those metal brushes or knife handles can actually damage the insulation. Handling instruments with care, using a non-slip surface in the operating room to set the instrument on, or putting them back in the holster that you have, can prevent it from falling on the floor. And of course, only using the instruments as intended. And finally, although they may not be always visible to your eye, still visually inspect these instruments. And if any damage is noted, communicate that as soon as you notice something, especially if the patient is still in the operating room, to give that time where we could evaluate it and not miss it before the patient leaves the room. So another tip for saving information, this is something that Jamie laughs because we do it so often. We do it very often. Is to send something. If you think something is interesting or you have a question, send it to a friend, text it, send it in a message. I think this one was from LinkedIn. We saw something, so I sent it over and I said, save this, I want to read it later. Save this, I need to read this, and I linked the article. And this was actually an article that was done to evaluate current leakage or that, alternate pathway, right, in robotic instruments with visually intact installation. So I look at it, it looks fine. And after I read this, our discussion today just became even, more important to me. They found in this research study that there was stray currents in 100% of the instruments that they tested, with a mean leakage of 4.1 watts. So saving it later for me is kind of built-in accountability. Jamie's going to ask me, did you read it? Did you see it? Or I read it and here's what I got. And then I'll say the same thing to you that I say to Jamie is these results were just absolutely crazy. Jamie said, let's add it to our webinar. And I said, done. Here we are. Here we add it.
So we mentioned installation tester a couple times throughout this presentation, but how exactly does it work? Visual inspection is a critical training component for every single sterile processing professional, but as we noted a few times already, there's more to installation and electrosurgical instrument, which is where these installation testers come in handy. It can detect issues with the installation before it is used in the OR or on that patient. So it's important for techs to receive training on the function of the installation tester, how to use it, and what to look for. First notable piece is which tool or accessory to use with which instrument. So most of them come with a tri-ring accessory, and it's used for the shaft of a laparoscopic instrument. The brush accessory is for general electrosurgical instrumentation, so running the instrument through the bristles will test the insulation. Additional inspection steps include technicians should gently pull down the insulation at the distal collar. If the insulation moves, the instrument should be sent out for repair. So here's an example of a laparoscopic instrument being put through a tri-ring. So make sure the full shaft gets run through the tri-ring. Find the right spot for the diameter of the tool you are running through the installation tester. It should be fit but not snug. Do not force the instrument through the spot. You may have actually produce damage on that insulation. So if everything is good, the machine won't do anything. If the installation fails, you will see a fail light light up, indicating that there is an installation failure on the shaft of the instrument. So what are the next steps in your facility policy and in the instrument manufacturer IFU with a failure? Most of the time, it's notify your manager or instrument coordinator, and they will notify the OR for any remaining procedures scheduled for that day if it will affect that procedure. And what are we actually looking for, right? So that's another really important step. This is SPD's role in inspection, so what to actually look for. So oftentimes Michelle and I recreate a lot of different things, but let's give credit where credit is due. AAMI's amendments, they did a phenomenal job. They're very thorough and detailed, and I'm really impressed by what they did for this actual installation inspection. So no need to recreate the wheel. This is actually straight from the source. So in the first row of the chart, it discusses inspection points for laparoscopic instruments, and they actually have images in the amendment that are associated with that row to show what the potential damage could look like. So here's another figure for laparoscopic instruments showing nicks, lacerations, and pinholes, additional damage you may find. Next up we have is insulated forceps, and some of the spots tech should thoroughly inspect, which we've identified a lot of these things already in this presentation, because I took it straight from the source. Then when we get into cores, all things we've discussed previously in this presentation, where to make sure and what to look for and what to inspect. Again, this is coming directly from AAMI, A2 inspection of insulated instrumentation. Michelle and I do not make this stuff up. So there you go. Lastly, the problem, and I know we're getting close on time, so we'll cruise through this one, Michelle. Tools for communication are great, but sometimes it can be a mystery for the OR as to what's on turnaround and what's missing. This is often the responsibility for the sterile processing supervisor, manager, lead tech, whomever it is at your facility. So who's really in charge of out of service, repair, broken, or sharpened instrumentation? This could also include sterile storage area, techs picking cases, then reorder, restock programs with the materials managers, and for OR and SPD, but OR isn't aware of what is actually gone. There's a lot of people that are working with these instruments. So it's important to create a program to find answers when someone isn't available. So the sterile processing and the operating room can work together and are able to find an immediate solution.
So in the operating room, when an instrument is missing or not replaced or is placed in the wrong location, this is almost literally what OR staff will be up to, not spinning, right? But we're hunting, we're troubleshooting, we're using a workaround, we're going to try to find something that will work for what we need that we don't have. And we are calling sterile processing, probably a lot. right? We're probably absolutely driving you nuts, right? We're calling and calling. What happens is these case carts, when we're setting up for our cases, we'll prep the case we're about to do, but also we'll kind of grab a couple materials often for the case that's coming. So if I'm missing something in case number 3, I need to know about it in case number 1. So I have time to plan and troubleshoot. This is also known as beg, borrow, and steal, right? To get it in time so I can move forward for my patient and their procedure that they've been preparing for our patient.
And here are just some really simple communication tools that the OR and SPD can use to communicate with each other if something is broken or if it needs repair. And honestly, the more detail, the better. I know you're thinking, what does this have to do with electrosurgery instruments? But this can be an all-encompassing program, and it's really important to notify the OR and sterile processing both when things aren't available, especially when it comes to something that is critical in a lot of procedures. So create a checklist along with having tags in the facility to facilitate better communication between sterile processing and the operating room. Notify the charge nurse or lay out the path of communication in a facility policy of any immediate changes in instrumentation for the rest of the cases for the day. And here it is when we tie it into electrosurgery. The AORN guidelines actually discuss communication and specifically for installation failure. They said there should be a well-executed plan if something is broken and needs to be sent out for repair. As noted in 3.6.1, the clear path includes the OR and how that information needs to be relayed should be called out in a facility policy and practiced.
So we want to thank you. I know too, we are getting close on our time, but thank you so much for spending some time with us today, even an hour of your time. That really honors us. So thank you for choosing to do that. We like to end our webinars with a saying or a quote or just kind of something we thought really fit in to be fitting. And this just seemed really fitting for this conversation. Coming together, even over a frustration or a pain point, is a beginning. Keeping together through conversations or different communication tools, right, is a process. And then working together for our patient and their families, waiting in pre-op, in the OR, in post-op, right, wherever they are, is a success.
We don't want to recreate the wheel as a phase we use all the time in everyday life. Tasks and products that have already been created or invented for a designated purpose are there for a reason, but there's opportunity to make better and make more efficient and useful. The standards are there to help us with that. The metaphorical wheel is the industry standards. They're constantly being updated and updated to make us better. Use tools that are available to you, especially when you feel like you have nowhere else to go. Use your teammates in the operating room and sterile processing to work together and communicate. Like Michelle mentioned, it's our patient, and the stigma of us versus them has to be left in 2020, like a lot of things that we've noted in 2020 as well.
Yeah, so once again, thank you so much for joining us today. If you have any questions, I'm sorry, I know we only have a few minutes left for questions. Please email or LinkedIn or check out anywhere you can get a hold of us. We have a podcast, and on our website, we have a lot of other educational resources. So we would love to hear anything and everything from you.
Thank you both so much, Jamie and Michelle, for your time today and for a great presentation. As a reminder, if you do have a question for our presenters, please use the questions feature on your webinar dashboard. We do have a few questions and we have time for a few of those, so I'll try to squeeze in just a few. The first question is, if insulation damage is hard to see, what is the point of a visual examination?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think because sometimes you can is really the best answer. If you have an opportunity where you could possibly catch something, great. Catch it right at the beginning as soon as possible to mitigate any risk whatsoever. And I think it's a great second check. I always say that the operating room is actually the first and the last inspection. We check it right after our procedures, making sure everything is in order. And right before we use it, we should always be visually examining our instruments.
All right, our next question is, how can SP and OR communicate insulation damage?
Well, like we mentioned in our webinar today, it is important to have a facility policy to lay out that communication pathway. So, If there is an installation failure, if it happens in the operating room, a way for them to communicate to us in sterile processing so that we know to keep an eye on that and send it out for repair. Like I mentioned, oftentimes sterile processing is in charge of repairs. But like Michelle mentioned, if we, miss something when there's a lot going on, like we missed where something might be broken, but it may be very obvious to Michelle or the operating room, letting us know will help with that streamlining process. So communication tools are really easy, like little tags, or even just at that point where we intersect oftentimes is dropping off in decontam. Hey, we had this instrument that's broken. Ideally, it'd be better if it was written on a tag so it can go through the whole process with that instrument, because oftentimes the repair doesn't get sent out until it's actually cleaned through mechanical washers. So any source of information or communication or pathway that can be identified, put that in a facility policy and make sure people are practicing it.
All right, our next question is testing required in reprocessing IFUs routinely?
Installation testing?
I'm not positive.
Yeah, I bet you it's installation testing. Mm-hmm. And yes, if you have a laparoscopic or forceps or anything like that, they 100% say in their manufacturer IFUs that you need to do installation testing. And there are tools out there, like we showed at the end of the presentation. There are installation testers that need to be in a facility if you have laparoscopic instruments or if you have electrosurgical instruments that you are. Oftentimes for like cords or like I mentioned, arthroscopic shaver hand pieces that have that mechanical or that electrical component to it, they will talk about actually inspection points and what you should be looking for. And the standards, the new A2 amendments talk about it.
Great. That is all the time that we have today, but rest assured, if you did submit a question, I will pass that along to Jamie and to Michelle to answer after the presentation. Thank you again, Jamie and Michelle, for your time today and for a fantastic presentation. I would like to encourage everyone to visit today's sponsor to learn more about the products and the services they provide to our industry. Please visit keysurgical.com. A quick reminder that you can obtain your certificate by completing today's post-webinar survey. The survey will be emailed to you 1 hour after the completion of today's webinar, and you must complete the survey to receive your 1 continuing education hour. You'll be able to download your certificate once the survey is submitted. If you have any questions, please contact us at webinar@mdpublishing.com. We'll be back soon with another webinar. Please visit ortodaywebinars.live for more details and for complimentary registration. Thank you all and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.